Well, welcome everyone to the Integrated Deterrence Speaker Series of the Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security Lab of Arizona State University here in Washington, D.C. We have both an audience here and we have an audience online. I assume a fair number of individuals from Arizona, but also our student base is quite international. So there are people beaming in from many distances. We have today an outstanding guest speaker, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, and he will be introduced by Ambassador Ed O'Donnell of our faculty here at Arizona State University. I want to thank also my other faculty members in the room, Ambassador Mike Polt, Lieutenant General Ben Freakley, and Ambassador Rod Moore, who are filtered throughout the crowd here. And also our colleague from the law school, Andrea Cayley, who is with us this afternoon. I wanted to just briefly tell you that the aim of the Integrated Deterrence Speaker Series, which I share with General Freakley in terms of orchestrating, shall we say, is to explore, critique, and advance the doctrine of integrated deterrence to threats to the national security, which of course relates also to global security as it relates to American national security. And through this speaker series, we looked at different types of deterrence, obviously military deterrence, economic deterrence, cyber deterrence, educational, cultural, corporate, lawfare. But quite frankly, one might say that the first and foremost tool of deterrence is diplomacy. And we have the master of the art of diplomacy, the title of his book, with us today to speak. And so we're very, very pleased to greet you. I have to, since I've got the podium, tell you just one memory of Ambassador Eizenstat. He and I shared the morning Deputy Secretary's meeting for about, I don't know, at least 4 years, maybe 8, at the State Department during the Clinton administration. And we'd be sitting at the conference table of the Deputy Secretary of State each morning for our discussion about how policy would proceed during the day. There were 2 things you could always rely on from Ambassador Eizenstat in terms of first appearance. He would arrive with a long yellow legal pad, had notes on it, and would continue to be note-taking throughout the meeting. And you always knew that Ambassador Eizenstat was totally prepared. And then secondly, of course, when we looked for a sort of wise statement at the table, when Ambassador Eizenstat spoke, everyone listened because it was serious, professional, and spoke from experience. And I certainly learned a lot sitting at that table with him. So Ambassador O'Donnell, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome to all of you here in person and online. It's my honor to introduce my former boss at the State Department when he was Undersecretary for Economic and Business Affairs. I was his chief of staff in his immediate office, and I remember, David, the long legal pads that Ambassador Eizenstat used. His immediate staff, myself included, included the economic commercial officers, 5,000, the economic statecraft part of the State Department, when we reported to Ambassador Eizenstat while he negotiated trade agreements on behalf of the American people, workers, firms, and around the world. President Clinton, this is my remembrance, President Clinton asked Ambassador Eizenstat to negotiate unresolved issues of the Holocaust for the benefit of survivors of the Holocaust and families of the victims. That became his second job. So his immediate staff, myself, were watching Ambassador Eizenstat with 2 different portfolios, 2 different more than full-time jobs, incredible energy, creativity, and intelligence. And he held a high standard for all of those of us who worked for him, but we admired him greatly. And it's great to welcome you, Ambassador Eizenstat, to the Arizona State University campus here in Washington, D.C., the Barrett O'Connor Center. I just want to mention a couple of things. key leadership positions that over 6 administrations that Ambassador Eizenstat held. Domestic policy advisor to President Jimmy Carter for the 4 years of that presidency, which included Ambassador Eizenstat involvement in the Camp David negotiations. In the President Clinton administration, he held 4 positions: ambassador to the European Union, undersecretary for trade at the Department of Commerce, undersecretary for business and economic affairs at the State Department, where I worked for him, and finally, deputy secretary of Treasury. He also had continuing responsibility for unresolved issues of the Holocaust, and he, over that period, as well as the administrations of President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, he's still involved. And because of his efforts, billions of dollars have been allocated by governments for the benefit of Holocaust survivors, families of the victims, and other victims of the Nazi Holocaust and terror. He's also an accomplished writer and author. I'll mention the books that are required reading for my students at ASU: Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II. The Future of Jews, How Global Forces Are Impacting the Jewish People, Israel, and its Relationship with the United States. Very current for today. Another book that he's authored is President Carter, The White House Years, about his work with President Carter and also Camp David Accords. And what we're hearing today is about the most recent book earlier this year that came out, The Art of Diplomacy: How American Negotiators Reached Historic Agreements That Changed the World. You'll hear more about that. Currently, Ambassador Eizenstat is an international lawyer in Washington with Covington and Burling LLP. He also is the chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Council, appointed by President Biden. Throughout his distinguished career, he's received numerous awards. I'll mention just 2. He received the Great Negotiator Award from Harvard Law School, and also in 2021, he was awarded the Elie Wiesel Award by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I know that's very close to Ambassador Eizenstat because he knew Elie Wiesel very well, the Nobel Peace Prize winner and author. So, Ambassador Eizenstat, thank you for your service to the American people, and welcome. Help me welcome Ambassador Eizenstat.
Thank you very much. I really do feel very much at home because I've had interactions with so many of you. Ed and I worked on a day-to-day basis, and at State, it's a 24/7 job, and he was an enormous help. Ambassador Mike Polt, we worked together on Swiss bank issues, which were extremely difficult. And General Freakley, I know your great service in Iraq with David Petraeus, and he is one of the main characters in my book. And Ambassador Moore as former ambassador to Montenegro. So this is a terrific program at ASU. I've spoken here several times, and it really is a particular pleasure to do so now. I wrote this book for 3 reasons. The first is we live in very turbulent times when we face seemingly insoluble problems. And I wanted to show how over the last 50 years with American diplomacy, we were able to meet and overcome equally daunting problems and can do so again. Second, and something that's directly related to the course you're taking, is that we're in the midst of 2 hot wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and the threat of war always hovers over Taiwan. And during our own lifetime, we've gone through the Vietnam War, 2 Balkan wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, the 2 Iraq wars under President Bush 1 and 2, the Afghan War, which was the longest in American history, and the Libya War, which President Obama called his biggest mistake. And if we look at the history of those wars, we have a very mixed record in terms of the effectiveness of military force as an instrument in diplomacy, but properly done, it can be. And third, I wrote the book because I fear we're in an era of increasing isolationism in which we're going to retreat behind our two oceans and let the rest of the world take care of itself. And this would be catastrophic. It will leave a vacuum into which the Russias and the Chinas and Irans and others with very different interests and values fill, and we'll have an even more conflicted world than we have today. And so I wanted to show how engagement in the world had actually been a positive force and how we need to keep it up. Now, the art of diplomacy means being able to convince the other state or states that it's in their national interest to agree to something that's in ours. And that is an art form. It's not easy to do, but it's essential. And it's not a win-win situation like a poker game. It has to be, a win only. It has to be a win-win situation in which both sides feel that it's in their national interest, because the other side has to go back to their capital and convince their leaders and their public that they've agreed to something that's in their interest as well. Now, the starting point for a successful negotiation, but it's not necessarily the ending point, for reasons which I'll explain, is for the president to appoint the right person at the right time for the right issue. It's difficult to imagine the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, or the Good Friday Agreement without George Mitchell, which ended a brutal civil war, or Camp David without Jimmy Carter, or the Dayton Accords on Bosnia, ending the war in Bosnia without my late friend Dick Colebrook. But that's not sufficient, because if the parties themselves, as we see in Gaza today, don't share any mutuality of an end game, then even the best negotiators will confront what may be insurmountable problems. Now, in interviewing, as I did for this book, 130 people, almost every Secretary of State, Secretaries of Defense, CIA directors, leading generals, I found that there were a set of common skills that they all brought to the table. The first is an ability to grab a historical change when you see it and have a fierce determination to carry it to the end. Example, George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker, Jim wrote the preface to the book, who saw in the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which I can assure you no one anticipated, the possibility of not only reuniting the two Germanys, divided after World War II, but uniting Germany within NATO, a huge lift. Consider that the Soviets lost 20 million people in World War II. The British and French fought the Germans in 2 world wars. And indeed, Margaret Thatcher, our erstwhile ally, said during the negotiations, "I love Germany so much, I want 2 of them to keep them divided." The second attribute is courage, not necessarily the courage of the soldier on the battlefield, but really the courage to take political risks, to depart from the status quo, to abandon your own political base and take a risk for peace. Anwar Sadat, when he went to Israel after 4 wars, it was not a popular decision. His own foreign minister literally resigned when he flew to Israel, and his second foreign minister resigned at Camp David. And he pledged no more wars, a very courageous thing. More recently, in 2020, when Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, the Crown Prince of the UAE, normalized relations with Israel. This was not popular with his street, but he did it because he felt it was in their long-term interest to have Israeli technology and to integrate their economies. In Northern Ireland, a brutal civil war was raging. The British, in great British understatement, called it the Troubles, Well, the Troubles led to 3,500 people, Catholic and Protestant, being killed, and thousands of others being maimed, kneecapped. It was absolutely ferocious. And finally, with U.S. mediation, yes, but with courageous decisions by the leaders of the Catholic and Protestant communities, over oftentimes the objections of their own public, said enough is enough. We've got to end this fight. More on that later. A third attribute is a high degree of intelligence combined with wisdom and with great ability to make judgments about people. It's not being able to score an 800 on your SATs. And this kind of intelligence was brought by Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in their negotiations, which led to the Shanghai Communique and the opening to China. A really brilliant piece of negotiating. Next, when I asked Bob Lighthizer, who was President Trump's trade advisor, what he thought the most important attribute it was for his success, he said three things: preparation, preparation, and preparation. That is, knowing your brief inside out and knowing the other sides, because unless you do, you can't find the areas of compromise that are necessary to an agreement. Next is an attribute that's often ignored, and that is the ability to listen to the other side and put yourself in their shoes. You sometimes, frankly, get so wrapped up in your own rhetoric, in your own case, which you think you've made so brilliantly, that you don't really listen to the other side, and it just passes by. You've got to listen. Are they just giving talking points from the Capitol, or are they actually giving you their bottom line? And by putting yourself in their shoes, you have to ask yourself, what do they need to get out of the negotiation to end the conflict, to go back to their capitals? And again, that is something very difficult. Now, I want to give you an example of preparation before I talk about the ability to put yourself on the other side. So we're now on the 13th day and last day at Camp David. And President Carter has drafted 22 peace agreements, which he's shuttled between the Egyptian and Israeli delegations. And the morning of Sunday, the last day, Prime Minister Begin comes to President Carter's cabin and says, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. I want you to get a limousine to take me out of Camp David. I've got a El Al plane waiting at Andrews Air Force Base. And President Carter, realizing that this would potentially fatally affect Sadat, who had gone so far out on a limb to travel to Jerusalem and would be a stain on his own administration, because of his preparation, in this case, thoroughly reading and absorbing the CIA profiles on Sadat and Begin, knew that Begin had a soft spot for his 8 grandchildren. So he gets his personal secretary, Susan Cloud, to get the names of each of the 8 and makes 8 copies of the original photograph taken on day 1 when they came, and inscribes to each of the grandchildren Jimmy Carter with hope for peace, and then goes to Begin's cabin and hands him each of those 8 photographs. And he hears Begin vocalize the names of each. He sees tears coming to Begin's eyes and his lips quiver. He puts his suitcase down and he says, I'll make one last try for my grandchildren. And that was what was necessary to get it over the top. But it was preparation that did it. Now, in standing in the shoes of the other side, let me give you another wartime example. In the Yom Kippur War of 1973, a surprise attack by Syria and Egypt really had Israel on its heels. It was a total disaster, and Golda Meir, who was the prime minister, was taking huge flack for not being prepared. With the help of the United States, Richard Nixon and Kissinger sending arms and planes over. And by the way, one footnote, those planes largely came from the Shah of Iran because we didn't have time to get them over, and we swapped planes later, but that's another story. So Israel counterattacks and now has the whole Third Army of Egypt surrounded in Egyptian Sinai, which is the cream of Sadat's army. And this is a chance for Golda to recoup her lost political strength and destroy that army. And Kissinger says to her, Golda, if you do that, we can't support you. And it will be a Pyrrhic victory because you will have humiliated Sadat and he'll never make peace with you. You've got to give him an out. And they did. They created a corridor by which that Third Army went back, and that led to successful disengagements in 73 and 74 and 75 that Kissinger did, and then ultimately at Camp David, because Sadat had something to show and wasn't humiliated. Next is developing a trust and confidence relationship with your interlocutor. He is not your adversary. You have to look at him as someone who is in a joint enterprise with you, as difficult as they may be. Example, again, in German reunification talks, we're really hitting a brick wall, particularly with the Soviets, and particularly the notion of the reunited Germany being within NATO. And Jim Baker takes Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, away from Moscow, away from Washington, away from the lights, away from the press, and takes him to his retreat in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And they bond there. They talk about their children, their grandchildren, their hopes for a peaceful, united Europe. And that broke the diplomatic ice and allowed Shevardnadze to actually take a position totally contrary to his own foreign ministry. It wouldn't have happened without that personal contact. I had that when I was negotiating the German slave labor agreement with Count Lambsdorff. And when you don't have that personal relationship, as you didn't at Camp David too, between Barak and Arafat, it's trouble. Next is creativity. And I call it the art of diplomacy because it is like an artist painting on an easel. You're always going to hit what seem to me in hurdles and walls that you can't see a way around. And you need to be creative in doing it. Example, in the Good Friday agreements. So George Mitchell has been negotiating with 13 different parties. Catholic, Protestant, some committed to peace, some committed to continue to fight. And during the negotiations, literally during the negotiations, they were killing each other. The Civil War was still going on. And people said, you've got to get the de-accession of arms from these militias if we're going to make any progress. But neither would put their arms down. They so distrusted the other. And so in the end, by a creative set of principles, which later became known as the Mitchell principles, he said, okay, you can keep your arms, but you have to sign a piece of paper that says you're going to resolve this conflict peacefully. And that creativity allowed the negotiations to continue. Next is sheer stamina. These negotiations are not day-long or week-long or month-long. They're often year-long. And they take, it's like a marathon, which always ends with a sprint at somehow 3 o'clock in the morning. And you've got to be able to think clearly and have the stamina to keep going. As the whole term shuttle diplomacy was because of Kissinger in the 73 war going with almost no sleep so he could keep the momentum going between Syria and Egypt and Israel. Jimmy Carter got an average of 3 hours sleep for 13 days. And when I was doing the Kyoto climate change negotiations, we were lucky if we got 4 hours of sleep. Next, if I can use a baseball analogy, I guess we're over the World Series now. I saw the last pitch as well. And that is, negotiators shouldn't swing for home runs. You shouldn't try to pile too much into an agreement or it may all collapse. You should go for singles and doubles and then build on that. So, for example, initially, Jimmy Carter sought a comprehensive solution to the Middle East and a reinvigoration of the Geneva Conference with the Soviet Union as chairs, with all 22 Arab countries and Israel. It just wouldn't work. There were too many issues and nothing would happen. In fact, I still think that the reason Sadat went to Jerusalem is because he realized he would never get the Sinai back otherwise. And therefore, going for smaller agreements, like a bilateral agreement between Egypt and Israel, gave us peace for now over 40 years, even during Gaza. It led to the Jordan and the UAE and the Abraham Accords because we didn't seek too much. Next is the use of back channels. And this is necessary when the two countries or multiple countries are so distrustful of each other that they won't get into the same room. So, for example, the Oslo Accords in 1993 were back channel negotiations involving the PLO and Israeli non-governmental officials, except for one. And they were carried out with such secrecy that literally Prime Minister Rabin did not know they were going on until they produced a framework and brought it to him, and then negotiations could go more public. John Kerry used a back channel, and by the way, in Oslo, it was Norway that served as the sort of intermediary. John Kerry, in negotiating the nuclear agreement of 2015 with Iran, the JCPOA, initially started because Iran and the US wouldn't get in the same room by using the Sultan of Oman, Abbas, who had good relations with both Iran and the United States, as a sort of back channel to start trading ideas. And therefore, there was enough confidence to get the parties together later. Next, and this is something we may see in a week, and that is, there is always a temptation for a new president to come in and think that because he's won, or she's won, we'll see, that they can abandon what their predecessors have done. They can do it better. So let me give you polar opposites. We lose the election in 1980 to Ronald Reagan by a landslide. And one of the issues he used against us was the SALT II nuclear agreement, which he said gave too much to the Soviets and we got too little out of it. And yet, he had the wisdom when he was president not to abandon SALT II, even though it had never been ratified by the Senate, but to implement it fully and for the full term, as did the Soviets. And then he built on that by the START agreements with even deeper cuts. He realized that if he had departed from what Carter did, it would upset too many apple carts. There's too much on the table. Contrast that with what happened with the JCPOA. JCPOA had built-in implementation terms every 6 months. And even in the Trump administration, no one ever alleged that Iran violated the JCPOA. And Trump felt, if it was done by Obama, I can do it better. And he pulls out of the JCPOA unilaterally, leaves all the other parties to it, the so-called G5+1, the Security Council countries in Germany. and says he's going to use maximum pressure to get a better deal and deny them the economic benefits of what they had agreed to. So where are we now today? October 31st, 2024. Almost 10 years later, in 2018, he pulled out. And instead of having 2.5% enriched uranium, which they had gone down to, which is civilian grade, we now have 60% enriched uranium, and they're within 3 weeks of being able to go to 90%, which is total military grade. Instead of having 2/3 of the centrifuges, which were churning out enriched uranium, we now have a whole new generation of Iranian centrifuges, which are churning out enriched uranium at ever more rapid and higher levels. Instead of having the plutonium plant at Iraq disabled and cemented, which it was, it's now been reconstituted. And the IAEA inspections are not as intrusive as they were before. It was a disaster, in my opinion, because we departed. And in climate change, we have absolutely no credibility in our climate change negotiations because, depending on who the president is, we're either in with both feet or without both feet. So Bush 1, Bush 2, Trump pulls out of the Paris Agreement, and Democrats come in and they're in. And so everybody is looking for what happens in a week. Are we going to continue to be in, or are we going to go back out again? I mean, how the hell can you have a negotiating posture if you're that uncertain? And last, and this will take me directly to the military side, the last thing a negotiator has to do is creatively use leverage. And we have two types of leverage to use. One is positive leverage, being a superpower. It's the leverage of opening our markets up for other countries' goods. In the case of the UAE and normalizing relations with Israel, they didn't go to Israel for the last piece of the Abraham Accords. They went to us. And President Trump properly granted them F-35 fighter jets, which is what they really wanted. And that was positive incentive to get them to normalize relations. The negative leverage takes several forms. First are economic sanctions. And during the Clinton administration, as Ed will remember, I was sort of the sanctions meister. I negotiated with the EU on Helms-Burton and the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act and so forth. And economic sanctions are not as effective as they used to be, in part because we have so much globalization of supply chains. We don't have a monopoly on many of the key products. Just think now, we have more economic sanctions against more countries than all the other countries in the world combined. We have sanctions against Maduro in Venezuela. He's still there. We have sanctions against Putin in Russia. He's still pushing forward in Ukraine. We have sanctions against China. We have sanctions against Iran. So yes, they have a role, but they're not dispositive. Another negative leverage is the threat of war rather than actual warfare. So, example, 1994 in Haiti, President Clinton sends former President Carter, Colin Powell, and Senator Sam Nunn to Haiti to try to convince the dictator who had staged a coup against the popularly elected prime minister to give up his seat of power and allow the prime minister to come back into the country and govern. And it didn't work until Clinton sent over a number of warplanes, and the general got the word that he was going to be forcibly ousted if necessary, and he left. So the threat of war can also be useful. I think in Kosovo, the threat of ground forces and in Bosnia was very important. And the last negative leverage is the one I think you've been focusing on in your course, which is actual warfare. Now, this is I've served in 6 administrations that said this is the most difficult decision a president has to make. You're putting our men and women at harm's risk. And so there are a number of lessons that I got in talking to a number of the generals and others involved about the use of force and presidents. First is it should be the last option after you've exhausted all the others, after you've tried diplomacy, after you've tried economic sanctions, after you've tried the threat of war. And I think Ambassador Schaefer, you work with Madeleine Albright, and you will remember that President Clinton was extremely reluctant to use force in Bosnia until the Srebrenica massacre. And even then had some qualms. And Madeleine was a very strong advocate at that point at the UN for doing it, but he really hesitated. He had used, he had inherited the use of force from President George H.W. Bush in Somalia. We all remember the Black Hawk Down incident. And he, in his early weeks of his presidency, Clinton, tried to go after one of the warlords, and they ended up shooting down a helicopter. We had a dozen Americans who were killed. And he's told me, and he said it publicly also, that one of his great regrets is not using force in Rwanda. But one of the reasons he didn't is that Somalia memory. And that haunted him even in Bosnia. So again, it should be the last option. Second, it should be in the supreme national interest of the United States. So let's take an example. There is a horrendous genocide going on right now in Sudan. Horrendous. I mean, Mike, David, you're the war crime of the first order. And you've got Arab Sudanese who are killing tens of thousands of Black Sudanese. It's really horrific. But it's simply, to be very blunt about it, not sufficiently in our national interest to go in the middle of this kind of conflict. Next, and this is critically important, and it's a mistake that Israel has made to this day in Gaza. And that is, this is something I got actually from Steve Hadley, who was National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, Bush II, and from Condoleezza Rice, his Secretary of State. And that is, before you commit your forces to invade another country, before the first bullet is shot, you should know what the political outcome is of the military you're using, and that it's reasonably achievable. And as Steve Hadley said, we did it backward in Iraq. Yes, we could depose Saddam, but then what? So it's really critical. And to this very day, in Israel, in Gaza, there wasn't any, and there isn't any post-war plan. Who governs? Who provides security? Who provides humanitarian aid? Who's going to run the schools? Who's going to run the hospitals? And so this causes really catastrophic problems. Next, and this is what General Petraeus told me, he said, you really need to have a nuanced understanding of the country before you invade. Understand their internal politics, their culture, their history, what makes them tick. Or you shouldn't go in at all, and we didn't have that kind of knowledge in Iraq or in Afghanistan. He also had, as as General Freakley will remember, he and General Freakley turned around that war. And he said he had three propositions. One was clear the area of terrorists. Second was hold the area. And if you look at Gaza, by the way, it's so painful to see this. I mean, I've gone to Israel like 50 times. So they cleared northern Gaza, right? They cleared it out, but they didn't put enough troops in to hold it. And now they're back in northern Gaza. So you have to clear and hold. And third was build. That is, convince the civilian population that they're better off economically, in terms of building a better life, without going over to the terrorist side. And he told me that he had a sign in his office that said, "How many Iraqi civilians have you helped today?" And again, just think about that in Gaza. Now, I mean, I feel that Hamas has to be eliminated without question. But not enough has been done to try to convince the Gazans that they're better off without Hamas. It's got to be a major component. Next is recognize the barriers to success militarily and the costs before you go in. So, for example, in Afghanistan, we really didn't appreciate until well into the war that Pakistan was a safe haven for the Taliban. They could just go over the border. Cambodia served that same purpose in the Vietnam War. You know, Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, said, "Everyone has a great plan when he goes into the ring until you get hit in the nose." And in Kosovo, in 1999, we led NATO in bombing Serbia for 77 days to try to convince Milosevic, which we finally did, to come to the bargaining table. And one of those days of bombing, we mistakenly bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And to this day, they believe we did it on purpose. So you always have to build in the fact that there are going to be unanticipated problems. Next is a doctrine that Colin Powell mentioned when I interviewed him, and that is he actually didn't use the term overwhelming force. He insisted to me decisive force. So President George H.W. Bush did it right. Saddam invades Kuwait, and what President Bush one does, along with Jim Baker and Colin Powell, is he goes to the United Nations and gets a resolution authorizing the use of force. Now, one of the things you have to do oftentimes to be creative in negotiations is be ambiguous. So the Russians would not agree to a direct reference to the use of force, but we use the term all appropriate measures, which meant the same thing. We got a NATO resolution on the use of force. We got a congressional resolution on the use of force. And he assembled a 35-country coalition, of which 28 donated troops, and we have 500,000 troops to push Saddam out of Kuwait, and a very limited political objective, which was just get him out of Kuwait. And there was tremendous political pressure on Colin Powell and on Baker and Bush. You know, I mentioned the Third Army and the Egyptian Sinai, and that is they really had the capacity to do away with Saddam right then. They had enough manpower. He was retreating. And they famously said, yes, we can take Baghdad, but then it will be ours. Well, contrast that with his son 12 years later. And there, Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, says, we're going to go in to Iraq to depose Saddam with a quote unquote light footprint. And we actually deploy some of the forces we had in Afghanistan, and we didn't have decisive force in either theater. And he had no UN resolution and no NATO resolution and a very thin coalition of countries. It was basically ourselves and the Brits. Again, he didn't learn the lessons. And last, and with this I conclude, and we'll take questions now, and that is, if you're going to use force, you have to have good intelligence. Now, remember that the reason we went into Iraq in 2003 was because we were convinced there were weapons of mass destruction, and there were none. The intelligence obviously was not good, but it was not good for another reason, and a more fundamental reason. And that is something I found in doing the research for this book. He did have weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical weapons. He did have them, but he had secretly destroyed them before we went in compliance with UN resolutions. Well, if that's the case, why didn't he say so and save himself and save his regime and save thousands of casualties on our side and theirs? Because he was afraid if he said so publicly, it would empower his domestic opponents and convince Iran to invade. Now, I was a product of some of the worst, maybe the worst intelligence failure in American history. So let's think now about Iran in the Carter administration. And the Shah has served under 6 presidents, Republican and Democrat. He was our guy in the region. He had an open shopping list of any arms he wanted. And 6 weeks before he is forcibly deposed by the radical Islamic revolution, 6 weeks before, and I have the document, now been declassified, the CIA reported to him that Iran was in neither a revolutionary nor even a pre-revolutionary state. 6 weeks before. Now, how can a president make a good decision on that kind of intelligence? And they also didn't realize, this was our guy, they didn't realize that he had incurable cancer that could have affected his decision-making possibilities. And I'll close with Gaza. So Dennis Ross and I co-chair a think tank in Jerusalem. And during the Gaza war, we got briefings from several high-ranking Israeli generals and intelligence officials. And they said that this was their worst intelligence failure, maybe worse than the 73 war, because they hadn't realized that Hamas had transformed itself from a terrorist group that would occasionally send some terrorists in to do a little mayhem, but they were always captured or killed, into a full-blown terrorist army, 35 to 40,000 strong, organized by battalions, heavily armed by Iran, very well organized. And they said, yes, we knew they had tunnels, but we thought they were only the tunnels from Egypt to Gaza. They didn't realize they've now found 150 miles. They think there may be 300 miles of tunnels. And some are as deep as 25-story building. That's where it's now thought that 80% of their weapons actually came internally, not from Iran. They were able to make them in these tunnels. And they would take some of the humanitarian products that came in, water pipes and things, and they would divert them to make bombs. So good intelligence is absolutely critical. Having said all of this, and as we go into the question period, diplomacy is critical. If done right, it can be very effective. It has to be done with a lot of the elements I mentioned. But it requires one other thing which Tony Blinken told me in his interview. And that is to be really effective, the United States has to continue to be strong militarily, economically, and politically. And that when you have the kinds of polarization that we have now, it affects the capacity of diplomats for the United States to be effective. And it's not always the strongest party that wins. North Vietnam wasn't the strongest party or had the strongest military. The Taliban didn't have the strongest military. They had a proverb that said, "You have the watches, but we have the time." And Putin is saying the same thing right now. And depending on what happens in the election, you're going to see something potentially very drastic happen. So we have to try to be united. I mean, we used to say politics ends at the water's edge. Now it doesn't. And we've got to get back to that to have effective diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Eizenstat. You really touched so many themes, and I know there are a lot of ideas and questions out here. The concept of integrated defense that you ended with is certainly a theme that we have here today. I'd like to first ask Ambassador David Sheffer to pose his question, and then we'll open it up for the audience and maybe other of those here in person or those who are online. Feel free to submit your questions in the chat, and we'll try to integrate that into the question and answer session. But first of all, Ambassador David Sheffer.
Thank you, Ambassador Eizenstat. Thanks so much. Not only was that a book is, and I encourage everyone to seize their copies of it. Force behind diplomacy, which sort of was the theme of your chapter on the Balkans conflict. Can you translate any of those lessons to the Ukraine conflict today, where we have a limited application of force through the provision of armaments, but not either an air or a ground presence in Ukraine? Is there any utility to go beyond what we have done so far with respect to how that principle is applied to the Ukraine conflict?
Thank you. I want to make, if I can, another general point, by the way, and then I'll get directly to this. And that is, we shouldn't look at war or the military and diplomacy as two separate things. We need to have them integrated even during the fighting. So, for example, Ambassador Ron Newman, who was our ambassador in Afghanistan, told me that he asked, during the war, he asked for $600 million in humanitarian and economic revitalization aid, so that as we were fighting, we could also be helping the people and they could tangibly see that. Of the $600 million he asked for, he got $45 million, and $11 million of that was in simple debt restructuring. So you shouldn't just leave the war to the generals, and the best generals don't want to have the burden fully on them. They want to have an economic component. Now, with respect to Ukraine, Kissinger told me that, very simply, you can't win at the negotiating table what you don't achieve on the battlefield. And that wars generally end when one or both sides feel that they can't achieve anything more militarily without catastrophic costs. Now, I think that's why it is critical to resupply Ukraine, and in my opinion, to resupply them with the most sophisticated arms as rapidly as possible. Now, I think the Biden administration has done a very good job of keeping the NATO allies together, but they have had to be dragged into providing the Abrams tanks, the anti-missile systems, the F-16s. They ultimately do, but with painful delays. And even today, there was an article in the New York Times just yesterday that even the arms that we have agreed to supply them are still not there. I mean, it's not going to do them any good in the wintertime. They need it now. And so I think that we want to give Ukraine the ability to get as much territory back as they can to put themselves in the strongest negotiating posture. Now, this war will end. A year, maybe a year and a half, it will end. I mean, the Russians have lost half their Black Sea fleet, 300,000 casualties. They have to use 10,000 North Koreans to continue fighting. But I think it's going to be a different type of end of the war agreement. I don't think it's going to be an actual peace treaty. I think it's going to be more like the 1953 Korean armistice, which ended the Korean War. It's not a full treaty. There's never been a treaty. And yet there's been no conflict for 70 years. Now, part of the reason is we have 30,000 troops there, okay. And I think that the way it could work out here is in Ukraine, at some point you sort of freeze the conflict, hopefully again with Ukraine getting as much territory back as they can, but they're not going to get it all back. They simply are not. It's a painful reality. But neither should they be in a situation where their allies, where ourselves, recognize the territorial integrity of what the Russians have gotten as being theirs. Nor should we give up all the economic sanctions, unless Putin does much more than he's probably willing to do. So it will be that type, I think, of armistice. Next is we mustn't negotiate behind Zelensky's back. We've actually done that twice. Kissinger got a Nobel Peace Prize for the Vietnam peace treaty, which was really not a peace treaty. It was a withdrawal treaty. And it was negotiated only with North Vietnam. Literally, the Saigon government, for whom we lost 58,000 troops, all in that wall a couple of blocks from here. And yet that government was not at the negotiating table. And once something more recent, in the Trump administration, and Biden continued it, when the deal was reached with the Taliban, I mean, Biden only changed the date from May to August. That negotiation was done between Secretary of State Pompeo and Zalmay Khalilzad, our guy, and the Taliban without the Afghan government being in the room. And then we said, oh God, they all fell apart when we left. Well, we left all the troops left, all the private contractors left, all the people who maintained the equipment we gave them left, and they weren't in the room. Now, just this week, former President Trump said that within 24 hours of being elected, he's going to get on a jet to Moscow. I mean, are we going to do that again? Are we going to reach an agreement and force it down the throat of Zelensky? Is that what that means? And last, I mentioned the importance of putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So let's now put ourselves in Zelensky's shoes. Okay? At some point, whether Harris wins or Trump wins, there will be a negotiation. And we're going to be saying to Zelensky, okay, it's time to have a ceasefire. We've given you as much as we can. And just look, it took 6 months to get the last 40 billion aid. Do you think we're going to get another $40 billion from Congress? So he's at the negotiating table. We're in his shoes. And he says, you Americans have a saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And he says, just look, 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia gets Ukraine to give up what was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a piece of paper, says that Russia won't go further into Ukraine, which they violate. Twice, the second occasion is with the so-called Minsk 1 and 2 agreements in 2014, 2015. And we, the United States of America, were party to this. And we say we assure, we didn't say guarantee, we assure Ukraine of our support if Russia goes any further into Ukraine. So this is 2014, 2015. So fast forward to 2022. They invade on February 24th, 2022. February 21st, Putin says publicly, Minsk is no more. He just rips it up. So Zelensky's going to say, you want me to get into this a third time? How do I know that he's not just going to rest and reload and go back again? You're not going to let me into NATO, at least not right away, where I have an Article 5 protection. So what am I supposed to do? What assurance do I have? Now, that's a tough question to answer. And the best I can come up with is the following. First, a series of bilateral, not mutual defense, but mutual assistance programs. As Biden reached some maybe 2 months ago, 10-year agreement in which we agree to supply Ukraine enough arms to try to defend themselves. And I hope the Germans and the French and the British and the Swedes and others do the same thing. So at least Putin has to think twice about going back in. Second is as rapid, and I was ambassador to the European Union, as rapid as possible in entry into the European Union. Now, it's not a club. There are democratic, check marks that you have to reach, which they're not there. There are anti-corruption check marks, which are not there. But getting them into the EU would be a major deterrent, not because there's a mutual defense agreement between the 27 countries. There isn't. But because I think it would be very difficult for Putin to invade an EU country. I think it would bring the wrath of God down on him. And third, there are right now some NATO trainers in Ukraine who are helping train the Ukrainians with the use of some of the equipment. And if they can stay, even in a small force, they might be a deterrent. Now, by the way, I'd love to get the generals thinking on this, because I still believe that we might have avoided a catastrophe in Afghanistan if we had kept 3,500 troops there as we have in Iraq. Some presidents think that might have been different. And Kissinger, obviously in his defense, said, I still think the Saigon government could have withstood the North Vietnamese at least for a year and a half if Congress hadn't passed the Mansfield Amendment to totally defund not just our presence, but the South Vietnamese army. So anyway.
General Freakley, I think you've been addressed, and if you could comment or
Well, I'll just say that after serving there for 13 months as the commanding general of the Combined Joint Task Force, I couldn't agree with you more. And General Scott Miller, who was the 4-star in charge when the decision was made to withdraw appealed directly to the president, not for 3,500, but for 2,500. And with 2,500 troops deployed in support of the Afghan National Army, Afghan Border Police, and Afghan National Police, he believed they had the wherewithal to provide the security for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. But it would also take exactly what you spoke to, Ambassador, and that is, number one, pressure on Pakistan to either be in or out, but not a sanction or not a sanctuary. And secondly, the corruption in Afghanistan by corrupt political figures had to be addressed. And but that could have been addressed simultaneously. To your point about diplomacy and military activity go hand in hand. All forms of whole state solutions should go hand in hand. But what that 2,500 soldiers brought was intelligence, medical support, supply support, and air power.
You mean in Iraq?
In Afghanistan.
Okay.
They because they were there, we could help the Afghan military with air support, intelligence, logistics, and medical support. But to your point, when we left, that all fell apart, and they fell apart. But we'd be there today, continuing to allow that government to mature and grow and stand strong against the Taliban. But we failed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think tactically, it was also a mistake if you did decide to withdraw. And again, I felt so strongly about keeping some troops there that if we had kept Bagram Air Force Base open and had all the evacuations occur, including those Afghans who risked their lives to help us. I mean, this is an unbelievable tragedy. These guys really put their necks on the line. Get them all out before you take the troops out of Bagram, not take the troops out first. It just so pass backwards.
We had 4 10,000-foot runways. 4. Jalalabad, Kabul, Bagram, Kandahar. And we closed them all down to 1.
Yeah.
The other point, if we're still there, and we had Bagram in particular open, then you have an American presence just over the shoulder of Iran. And we would have given our diplomats more grounds to have close proximity forces that could influence activities in Iran if our diplomats chose to use that leverage to talk about what's to be done. I know you have a question from the audience, but I'd like to ask just a quick question, and that is, in this series on integrated deterrence, we've heard a speaker talk about the absolute imperative for hard power. You've got to have hard power first or nothing. But I question that from a perspective of, shouldn't we have a balanced portfolio of capabilities? And I would like your assessment of, are we balanced? Do we have the resources behind diplomacy, behind economics, behind national will? Are we putting our resources in the right places to deter other actors from a whole of government approach?
Well, we do need, thank you, a whole of government approach, and we don't do that. We starve the domestic side. But there's something else that happens, and maybe you can relate to this because you said you served 13 months. And that is one of the things that I got in a lot of my interviews is that, number one, we don't really understand the countries we go into. We don't have, even the diplomats, we don't have the language capacity, and then they get rotated out every 3 years. But in the military, they get rotated oftentimes every year. So just when they're putting their plans in effect and they've really got their feet on the ground, they go to another theater. And that is a real mistake. We just don't keep people in long enough to implement what they've started. And there needs to be an absolute integrated command with the top diplomats, the top USAID people, and the top military all working in concert. Absolutely essential, and we don't do it.
Thank you to both of you and Ambassador Eizenstat. Do we have a question here in the audience?
I mean, you know, one of the things, General, I want to mention that I have it in the Iran chapter with the hostage rescue. It was always a risky military operation. you had to get helicopters in Iraq first, then you had to get them from the Desert Storm area into the center of a populated city and get people out. It was always but this was only corrected with the Goldwater amendments afterward. There was no integrated military command. So, for example, the admiral who was had the aircraft carriers did not coordinate with the Air Force generals who had the planes on top. And it was a lack of integrated training. There's not the economic side, but just on the military side. And now we have joint commands, and I think that's been somewhat corrected by the Goldwater Amendment.
We have a question from the audience. Dev, one of our graduate students at Arizona State University.
Thank you, Ambassador Eizenstat. The question I have for you is regarding sanctions. We've seen in the media too long that sanctions don't work. If anything, Vladimir Putin has increased his power because his economic is based on a military economy. But we haven't found a good resolution to replacing sanctions. For the next generation of policy in the State Department, what would you suggest to replace sanctions? Thank you.
Sanctions are least effective when they're used against countries who have one major commodity with a three-letter word, oil. I mean, the sanctions against Russia are actually extremely comprehensive. They can't engage in any dollar-denominated transactions, for example. No dual-use products. But when you have oil at your disposal, then you have China coming in and buying it at discounted rates, which keeps the Russian economy afloat. You have, there was a long article on this recently, a very creative Russian effort at creating fake companies and fake middlemen and fake flags on cargoes. Look like it's a neutral country's flag, and you create company ABC, which is not on the sanctions list, and it gets the product, and then it ultimately gets transferred. So sanctions are really very, very difficult. We come to sanctions, again, because we oftentimes don't have many other alternatives. Diplomacy hasn't worked. I mean, we tried diplomacy with getting Maduro out of Venezuela. We tried the OAS. We tried to get some of the neighboring countries, Brazil and Chile and others. And when you've got a military force that is loyal to Maduro, it's very difficult. And he's got oil. I mean, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And we're afraid to go after the sanction of his oil, which would, of course, potentially really bring him down, but it would also cause $100 barrel per oil and wreck the whole economy of the world. Now, let's take a situation which I was directly involved in. So the hostages are taken in Iran, and we have our first meeting in the Situation Room in the basement of the White House. And I mean, I'm not a military guy. I was a domestic advisor, but this obviously touched economics. And so I said, I think we should do what President Kennedy did in Cuba, which is blockade Cuba to get the Russian missiles out. And we should blockade Karg Island, which is an island right off the Iranian shore where about 60% of their oil comes from. And we should either blockade it or mine the harbors. And that if we did that immediately, Khomeini had not consolidated his power. And I thought that that kind of economic and military sanction could work. And the objections were twofold. One, which I fought against, was that, well, they'll then kill the hostages. And I said, they're not going to kill the hostages. That's their only leverage, number one. And number two, they know if they kill the first hostage, there'll be World War III against them. And in fact, Carter, through the Swiss, told them, if you touch one hair on the head of any of those hostages, if you put them on show trials, we will use military force. And they didn't. So I think the same thing would have occurred. Do not think they would have come back in coffins. The second was more difficult for me to argue against, and that is the Defense Department said that if we have that kind of an embargo, either an actual blockade with our ships or man the harbors, that the Soviet Union, to ingratiate itself to the new revolutionary government, might use their minesweepers, and then we'd be in a genuine collision with Russia, Soviet Union. That was a more difficult issue to face, but I even think there that it was such an untoward act to go into another country's embassy and take its diplomats hostage. I mean, remember that, like the French embassy here, I got a French Legion of Honor award last month, and that's their sovereign territory. Any embassy we have abroad is our sovereign territory. And I don't think that would have happened, but it certainly was a risk. But the alternative was trying diplomacy with no leverage. 444 days of negotiating, and we did try economic sanctions. We couldn't get the Europeans to agree not to buy Iranian oil. And so we just didn't have the kind of economic levers. And when you don't have those, then you really are in deep trouble. And you either decide to go to war or threaten war, or you just keep talking. And so we kept talking right through the election and lost the bloody election.
One question from online that I'd like to pose to you, Ambassador Eizenstat. Do you think negotiation with Muammar Gaddafi could have prevented the Libyan crisis and a peaceful transition from Gaddafi to another regime?
So this is
yes. If yes,
yeah.
What skills do you think the Obama administration failed to employ in the Libyan case?
Yes, well, the Obama said it was his worst mistake. So first of all, Gaddafi had already agreed with international inspections and so forth to give up any nuclear capability. So that was off the table. Is Gaddafi a good guy? He's no better or worse than Saddam. They're terrible dictators. But we didn't ask the question that I've talked about here, which is before we go in and depose somebody, what is the alternative? And look where Libya is in a complete mess right now. They've got 2 leaders, 2 armies. It's just catastrophic because we didn't say, what happens when you take this strong man out? Who do we put in? And we didn't have an answer to that. And we don't have an answer to that to this day.
You've been very generous with your time. Any last question from the audience that you'd like to pose to Ambassador Eizenstat? Go ahead, please, Ambassador Polt.
Ambassador, would you say, you talked about having the courage to take a political risk to achieve peace. Is it ever acceptable in your view to walk into a negotiation with the understanding that you're going to have to walk away and not seek agreement?
Yes.
Not reach agreement.
Yes. So I want to end on Gaza for a minute, but yes. So I'll give you a personal example. So we're now at the last day in Kyoto with the climate change negotiations. And We have 190 countries, and we had agreed to take quite deep cuts in emissions of 7% in 2010, 1990 levels. But we said to the EU, with whom we negotiated this, you have to take 8% because you've got a bubble around all your countries, but we have to be able to use what we call market mechanisms to reach our level. And we had an experience with that actually under George H.W. Bush, which was the ozone, the Montreal Agreement with SO2, where emissions trading between companies markedly reduced the cost without top-down regulation. So we kept saying this to the EU. We'll take these cuts, but we're not going to do it without market mechanisms. So we get to the last plenary session. And by the way, more generally, I talked at the beginning about having the determination to finish, but you can't make it appear that you want the agreement more than the other side. You cannot do that, or the leverage shifts. Okay, so here they start the roll call in the last plenary. It had gone over already a half a day beyond the deadline. The air conditioning was turned off, the translators had left, and we could hear the banging in the conference hall of the next exhibit they were putting on. And so they start A to Z, Angola, and they get to U for United States, and I stand up and say, no. And there was like a shock in the room. I mean, we were standing right next to the United Kingdom, and he said to me, what the fuck are you talking about? And I said, we made it clear we weren't going to do anything unless we had market mechanisms. So the head of the conference, an Argentine guy, takes us into the green room. John Prescott, who was the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK and headed their delegation to Kyoto, and we used ambiguous language to come to an agreement. So we said that regulations and measures could be used to achieve the goal, supplemented by market mechanisms. And we never defined what supplement. So they said, well, since regulations came first, it means that's the most important. And we said supplemented means totally supplemented. And that made Kyoto possible. And that's sometimes what you have to do. I mean, UN Resolution 242, after the 67 war, Land for Peace, said Israel is required to withdraw from territories, not the territories, although the French version is the territories, the English version is territories. It didn't define what the territories are. Now, I want to give one last example because it's what might have been. So I was in charge in the Clinton administration of the economic dimension of the peace process, both at state and treasury. So let's now go to July of 2000. And we had gotten Congress to pass something called the qualifying industrial zones, which meant that any country, and at that time it was Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority. We didn't have the Abraham Accords at that point. That if you had a peace agreement with Israel, under this legislation, you could create an industrial zone, and the companies in it could ship back duty-free to the United States if they used as little as 10% Israeli content, like unprocessed Israeli cotton. Okay, so I go to Gaza in July of 2000, and I'm the Deputy Treasury Secretary, and what I saw was beautiful. I saw 30 plants, not Israeli plants. These were American plants, European plants, Asian plants, and they were employing 1,200 Gazans, and they showed me where the second phase of the industrial park was going to be with another 30 plants and another 1,000 or 1,500 Gazans employed. So I went into one of the plants and I saw the products being loaded onto a flatbed truck. It went right through the Eretz crossing, which you've seen on all the maps in the War of Day, with no stop, and it went to the airport that we built for the Gazans, so they could export their cut flowers and their strawberries and these kinds of products. There was one unarmed Israeli soldier overseeing this. Okay? One unarmed Israeli soldier. So I go to Ramallah to tell Arafat, who I had negotiated with about a half a dozen times, how excited I was, and we were going to put more emphasis on this. We got the unemployment rate down to 8% in the West Bank and 14% in Gaza. And he says, before you start, I have something for you to tell your president, President Clinton. I said, what is that? He said, tell him not to invite me to Camp David for a second summit. And I said, well, why shouldn't he? And he said, I'm not prepared to make the compromises he needs to make it successful. He gets invited anyway. He doesn't make the compromises. The second intifada starts. 2005, and I wish we could show this to all these college kids who were demonstrating. 2005, a hardline Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, was one of the great generals in the 67 and 73 wars. And he decides that it is futile for Israel to remain in Gaza. He removes every IDF soldier and then has the IDF soldiers remove 7,000 civilian settlers. I mean, the videos are, I wish we could show these videos to these kids. I mean, kicking and screaming. They're pulled out of their house, out of Gaza entirely. Not one Israeli is left by the end of 2005. And they left the greenhouses. They left my industrial park that I talked about. All the infrastructure for a Palestinian entity to get going. Hamas wins the election in 2006. They take over from the Palestinian Authority, and they send rockets instead of roses to Israel. 2009, well, let's talk about 2000. Arafat turns the following deal down. And it's called the Clinton parameters. 95% of the West Bank for Palestinian state and East Jerusalem as a capital. 2009, Prime Minister Olmert offers Abbas, the current president who's in his 16th year of a 4-year term. And they offer him 96% of the West Bank and making up the other 4% by taking part of Israeli Sinai and East Jerusalem as a capital, and 50,000 refugees coming in to Israel to live with their families. And Abbas turns it down. Here we are.
Eizenstat, thank you so much for your time and insight. Ambassador Eizenstat will still be here for a little bit if you want to
Glad to sign any books
sign a
or
book,
whatever.
his book, The Art of Diplomacy. I think we still have some copies in the back. He'll be here for a few minutes willing to sign your books. Thank you all for coming online and here in person. Appreciate it.